welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, I'm Jenn, and this is Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library, and I'd like to introduce you to this week's guest. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book in your own words?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Jenn. I am Gretchen Felker-Martin, and my upcoming novel is Manhunt, a story about trans people surviving in the wasteland left behind by a global pandemic.
Very cool. I loved this book. I thought it was absolutely gripping. I couldn't put it down. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you kind of arrived at this project. If you could tell me a little bit about your previous writing career, what topics and themes have been important to you, and how these previous experiences led you to write this novel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you enjoyed it. I've been writing since I was a teenager, and I've probably got about 7 or 8 fantasy novels that will never see the light of day. No one is ever reading those. But for the past, I think, 6 years, I've been writing horror pretty exclusively, mostly body horror. I've been self-published for most of that, which is something I really enjoyed. I did all the editing and formatting myself. I have a cover artist who I love working with, Tom Horstman, and who I'm sure I'll work with again somewhere down the line. And I really enjoyed self-publishing. You know, you can write about whatever you want. There's no sort of concerns about marketability. I wrote a lot of medieval horror, stuff about witch trials and about like the demands of domestic labor in the early medieval period, like the 1100s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That's my novel, Ego Homini Lupus, is about a young Cornish woman who gets sold off to a knight who has no household servants, and so she has to keep up his entire haul. And it just slowly drives her insane over the years.
Oh, wow. That sounds really cool. I actually have a degree in medieval studies, so that sounds really interesting to me.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm sure you will find 10,000 things I got wrong.
Forward to seeing that. Like, as when I read medieval stuff, and this is a little bit of a tangent, I'm usually not so concerned about like accuracy and whether details are correct. I kind of like to see how you get like a feel for the era and sort of like the storytelling possibilities that are, possible within a particular time period. That sounds really
fun. Yeah, that's exactly how I approach it. I feel like the best medieval stories are not trying to be museum dioramas. They're taking this moment in time as an aesthetic and moral template for stories you can tell about how we live today. And I think that's really interesting. Medieval morality is so fascinating. So the morality of the ancient world.
Yeah, it really is. There's when you think about how medieval people viewed time, they saw their lives as sort of taking place on this like vast timeline from like creation to the destruction of the universe, basically.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in how that kind of shapes your view of your own place in the world. I think that's something that like really separates us from medieval people. That is pretty fascinating.
It really is. I actually in college, I studied the effects of the Black Death on infrastructure and scholarship, and you get to see this frame shift of how people think of themselves occur in real time. I mean, even author to author in the same logbook. It's so fascinating.
Oh, wow. That is very interesting. So when did you start writing Manhunt?
I believe it was at the tail end of 2019. I had just had a friend read me The Screwfly Solution by James Tiptree, Alice Sheldon.
Mm.
And I loved it. I mean, it's this incredible story about how, for some completely unknown reason, men all over the world start losing their minds and raping and killing women. And it's named, of course, for the programs by which colonists sought to eliminate the New World screwfly, which is a painful parasitic fly that lays its eggs in human skin. And what they would do is they would sterilize thousands and thousands of males and then release them into the population. And they, of course, would still go out and find mates, but they wouldn't reproduce. So then you get these mass die-offs of screwflies. Anyway, I was reading this story, and I thought, first, that it was amazing, and second, that there's this entire world of people it doesn't even touch, that it's so manifestly about heterosexual middle-class life. And I don't think that makes it less interesting. I think it's very insightful about those things.
Mm.
But as to where trans people are in that world, where queer people are in that world, how this is affecting different people, and how the ways it affects different people makes them feel about their relationship to their bodies and their gender, those things are completely opaque to us. And I thought, I think I could do something really interesting with that.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating perspective on the, I guess the genre, or sort of like the subset of apocalyptic fiction. Because I think when you think of, what occurred to me as I was reading was that in a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff, like let's say The Walking Dead, an apocalypse can kind of be like a power fantasy for, for cis white men, where they get to kind of play in a sandbox where there's no rules because society has crumbled, and they sort of like can live out these sort of fantasies. And I think that like widening the scope of whose perspectives on these type of situations you see really creates a lot of like very rich storytelling possibilities.
Thank you. That was really, really important to me when I was writing this. Not to throw shade at Robert Kirkman or anything, he's an excellent writer. But The Walking Dead and a lot of zombie apocalypse stories can kind of lean into this almost silent eugenics, where everyone who's undesirable and weak and who we don't want to look at is just silently killed. And we never have to deal with the reality of them ever again.
Mm-hmm.
There are no fat people, there are no disabled people, there are no really seriously, debilitatingly mentally ill people. It's a world where sort of this soft fantasy of eugenics has just sort of happened overnight.
Mm.
And so it has this sort of fascist leaning. And then on top of that, as you said, there's this fantasy that all of a sudden any kind of violence is permissible if you're defending, your family unit or your group or whatever remains. And often it's enacted on zombies who are unpersoned.
Mm-hmm.
And it just sort of, it creates this genre landscape that I'm very uninterested in.
Yeah, absolutely. There is this sort of like so much of that kind of storytelling. And again, not to, to diss Robert Kirkman, but like there is a lot of, just a lot of the sort of like stand your ground type mentality, is that like
yes,
any sort of incursion justifies a violent response that will see you kind of coming out on top,
Yeah, it's in a lot of ways, I think that the defining white male fantasy of our time is like the home invasion fantasy. This opportunity in a sick way to protect your family with violence, to kill someone who is undesirable and transgressing against your rights. It's very sort of embattled and colonialist. I find that a very ugly fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's therefore very interesting to write about and around.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I was very interested in is the world building in your book. It's very rich in terms of what the fallout of this kind of apocalypse would look like and what it would take to survive in such a world as a trans person. And I'm wondering, what was your process for coming up with the creative ways in which the main characters survive? Like, did you do survivalist research, or was it all thought experiment, or how did you arrive at like their the really creative ways that they find to get through this world?
Well, it was a combination, and I assume part of what you're referencing is the fact that they have to eat testicles.
Yes.
um, yeah, that actually came as a complete surprise to me when I was reading medical texts on which parts of the body are most estrogen rich.
Mm.
And it turns out that a lot of sort of the unprocessed estrogen in bodies with testicles is stored in testicles.
Wow.
But for a lot of the other stuff, it was a combination of the two. You know, I did a lot of reading about food preservation and like basic shelter needs. And I'm from New England, the novel's set in New England. So of course you have to contend with winter and everything.
Mm.
I learned a lot of interesting stuff about how long various foods keep. For instance, did you know that maple syrup stays good for about a century if you keep it in glass in a dark place?
Oh my gosh, I had no idea.
Yeah, basically unchanged. Wild.
Wow. So that would be like a really good sort of calorie dense something to subsist on in such a situation.
Exactly. You know, my grandfather used to drink little shots of it. I had no idea that he was being so prepared for the end of the world.
Yeah, what I thought was really interesting about it is how you get a glimpse at these sort of like, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but the sort of like invisible economies that would grow out of an apocalypse like this, because you have Beth and Fran who are harvesting testicles and they are taking it into places to be processed and then to be sold and distributed. And I thought it was just a really like very rich description of the kind of like self-made support structures that communities like this would have to find in that situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I'm a trans woman, and I think I don't know any other trans woman who hasn't had to get meds from a friend at some point because of a screw up at the pharmacist's or at the doctor's office, or, you know, running out of money or whatnot. I was also very poor for most of my life. It's been very, very recent that I know I'll be able to afford rent month to month. And so that kind of really practical day to day, make the bread, feed the babies struggle is still very, very real and present for me. And it's important for me to focus on it. I've always loved fiction about work, about complicated tasks and the way that they connect our lives. And so I really wanted to dig into that when I was writing Manhunt.
Mm. Yeah, I thought that was very well done. And I think that a lot of what makes the novel work so well, in my perspective, is your trio of main characters. So Beth, Fran, and Robbie, they're all imbued with these really, I keep using the word rich, I apologize, but these rich interior lives. And their inner landscapes are explored in ways that make their actions in the world around them make a lot of sense, even if they make decisions occasionally that like could be self-defeating or create conflict as opposed to ending it. And I'm wondering, what was your approach to character here? Like, how did you land on these personalities and these dynamics between them?
Well, some of it obviously comes from my own experiences, from the people in my life who I experienced some combination of love and resentment and frustration and, you know, all the other things that compose human connection toward. For Fran and Beth in particular, each other and how messed up it can get and how sort of long running and intimate it is. I've been a very visually obtrusive person my whole life. I'm very tall, I'm very fat, and so I'm used to being immediately evident. And I think a lot of that comes through in Beth, who has never passed, and who feels a lot of resentment and insecurity towards Fran for being more sort of conventionally, marketably attractive.
Mm.
And for her part, conformity and invisibility are much more accessible to Fran, and she struggles with wanting that to the exclusion of her connection to other trans people.
Mm.
And I think that's a very familiar feeling for a lot of trans women, myself included. There have been times where I wanted to just sort of fade into the wallpaper and stop having to deal with the consequences of being seen and being obvious. And, you know, I think that's at play in a lot of the relationships in the book. I think Robbie is a little more straightforward in that he's just sort of a mashup of a dozen trans guys that I know and love. And for all his oddball insecurities and other foibles, I think he's pretty straightforwardly a good guy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of all the characters, he is the way I guess that he has to survive in this world is so different from the ways in which Beth and Fran do. And even though they eventually kind of join forces and form this kind of like found family almost, the ways in which their different backgrounds and their experiences shape the choices they make, I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, Fran is middle class, and Robbie and Beth come from much poorer backgrounds, and I wanted that to be very apparent in their decision making and priorities.
It definitely comes through, and I think there is something very interesting with Beth and how trying to survive in this landscape, how often it would be helpful or help your survival to not be perceived, and so having to worry all the time about just being sort of perceived against your own will and how you're perceived and how the world reads you, I thought was like very, very touching and very, very moving.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I was really interested in was the idea that post-apocalyptic settings kind of allow us to examine our own world with a little bit of distance. And it struck me as I read your book that the dangers that Beth and Fran face, like TERFs and sociopathic billionaires, for instance, like aren't all that different from the dangers of living in our own theoretically pre-apocalyptic world,
Yeah, absolutely. I was being very direct and blunt. I have no interest in obfuscating it. Those people are monsters, and they deserve to be portrayed as monsters.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you have $1 billion, you are a demonstrably worse person than any serial killer in history.
Yeah, the things that you need to do to accumulate that much money are hard to justify.
Impossible, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as for TERFs, I think it's a cult of people who have experienced some kind of victimhood or who have become married to the idea of their own victimhood and now wield that as a cudgel against anyone more vulnerable than they are. And I think that's pathetic and contemptible.
Absolutely. And I think it's really damning in a way, that like this book is full of monsters who are these, feral, cannibalistic men, but that the real villains are all TERFs. They're all cis women who just, are stuck in this sort of, this victimized mindset.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that the last few decades in American society especially show us that whether or not the hand hovering over the nuclear button has French tips makes very little difference. A woman is just as imbued with all of the imperialist violence and entitlement and cruelty that America raises especially white people, to wield.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there's often this idea of yourself as sort of the victim. Something that was very important to me while writing this book was the idea of white women's tears, as Black scholars have discussed it for decades now.
Mm-hmm.
That white women use the appearance of their own weakness or their actual weakness in both a social and physical way to leverage violence against people with less social capital.
Mm-hmm. And we see that at work in the world all the time, from
Constantly.
Karens calling the police over people just minding their own business and stuff like that. And I think that there's like a real there's just like a real very interesting and terrible tension between the way in which they view themselves as victims, and then are also so hell-bent on victimizing others in order to sort of like compensate for that, I guess. Or
yeah, I think it's the only way they can make sense of themselves in their lives is to invent people who are victimizing them and then recoil in horror and clutch their pearls. I don't think they have any other way of connecting or moving through the world. And it's very sad.
Absolutely.
I'd be sadder about it if they weren't such monsters.
Yeah. Sad to a certain degree. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming to discuss your book with me and our listeners. I've had a really great time, and I'm so thankful that you were able to make the time to talk to us.
Oh, I'm so glad I could come. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. This has been Jen with Turn the Page podcast, in discussion with Gretchen Felker-Martin, author of Manhunt, coming to a bookstore near you next week. And it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.